Sunday morning in Bitter Creek usually meant salvation, but today it demanded a public reckoning. Abigail Preston, the Reverend's unwed daughter, was pregnant. Just as the righteous townsfolk prepared to banish her to the freezing wilderness, the church doors shattered inward. A towering mountain man stepped forward, growling, "That child is mine." Bitter Creek, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1882, was a town built on hard timber, harsh winters, and even harsher judgments. It was a place where a man's worth was measured by the calluses on his hands, and a woman's virtue was monitored closer than the town bank. At the absolute moral center of this unforgiving settlement stood Reverend Josiah Preston, a man whose sermons could strip the paint off a barn. Josiah was a widower, and his sole pride in this world was his 19-year-old daughter, Abigail. Abigail was the town's golden girl. She had hair the color of sun-cured wheat, and a demeanor so gentle that even the hardened drunks at O'Malley's saloon tipped their hats and watched their language when she walked past. She taught the Sunday school, baked peach cobblers for the ailing, and was widely expected to marry Billy Hastings, the arrogant but obscenely wealthy son of Mayor Archibald Hastings. It was a match that made sense on paper, the town's spiritual royalty merging with its financial powerhouse. But as the first snows of November began to dust the peaks of the Wind River Range, the town's collective eye noticed a change. It started with Henrietta Goggins, the town's postmistress and undisputed purveyor of gossip. Henrietta noticed that Abigail's calico dresses were being let out at the waist. She noticed the dark circles bruising the skin beneath the girl's eyes, and the way Abigail suddenly suffered from crippling nausea every morning at the mercantile. In a town like Bitter Creek, arithmetic was simple, and the conclusion was damning. Abigail Preston was pregnant out of wedlock. The rumor spread faster than a prairie fire. The baker whispered it to the blacksmith. The blacksmith told Sheriff Tom Dempsey. Sheriff Dempsey told his wife. Within a week, the golden girl was tarnished. When Abigail walked down the boardwalk, women who had once praised her pies now crossed the muddy street to avoid her shadow. Men stared with a mixture of contempt and crude curiosity. Yet, Abigail remained entirely, stubbornly silent. When confronted in the privacy of their parlor by her father, a confrontation that resulted in shattered china and Josiah's roars echoing down Elm Street, she refused to name the father. She bore his screaming, his tears, and his threats of eternal damnation with her head bowed and her hands resting protectively over her slightly swelling stomach. Far above the hypocritical whispers of Bitter Creek, up in the jagged ice-crowned crags of the mountains, lived a man the town only spoke of in hushed, fearful tones. His name was Morgan Montgomery. Morgan was a relic of a dying breed, a trapper and mountain man who had walked into the wilderness a decade ago and never truly come back. He stood 6'4", draped in heavy bearskin and canvas, with a thick, untamed beard and eyes the color of a winter storm. He only came down to Bitter Creek twice a year to trade pelts for salt, coffee, and gunpowder. The townsfolk gave him a wide berth. There were stories likely exaggerated, but terrifying nonetheless, that he had killed a grizzly with a hunting knife, that he had survived an avalanche by digging out with his bare hands, and that he harbored a violent, unpredictable temper. No one in Bitter Creek would ever think to connect the delicate, disgraced Abigail Preston with the hulking, savage Morgan Montgomery. They existed in entirely different worlds. The town's prevailing theory was that Billy Hastings was the culprit. Billy was known for his silver tongue and wandering hands, but when Mayor Hastings aggressively denied the rumors, threatening to foreclose on the mortgages of anyone who slandered his boy, the town backed down. Billy himself smirked through the accusations, loudly proclaiming that he would never ruin a good girl, and if Abigail was in the family way, she must have been a secret harlot all along. With the Hastings family washing their hands of her, Abigail's isolation was complete. She was a pariah in her own home. Reverend Josiah, blinded by his own righteous humiliation, decided that private repentance was not enough. The sin was public, and therefore, the reckoning had to be public. He decreed that on the first Sunday of December, Abigail would stand before the entire congregation to confess her sins, name the man who had ruined her, and be formally cast out of the church and the town. The stage was set for a tragedy. Abigail spent her nights weeping silently into her quilt, terrified of the impending Sunday. She had a secret, a dark and twisting truth about the child growing inside her. But fear kept her mouth clamped shut. The man who had actually forced himself upon her in the shadows of the autumn harvest festival was dangerous, protected, and entirely untouchable. To name him would not bring justice. It would bring a violent end to her and her unborn baby. Up in the mountains, Morgan Montgomery loaded his mules. It was time for his winter trade. He didn't know the storm he was walking into, but Morgan had never been one to run from a storm. Sunday morning dawned bitterly cold, the sky a bruised, heavy gray that promised a blizzard by nightfall. Despite the freezing temperatures, the First Congregational Church of Bitter Creek was packed to the rafters. No one wanted to miss the spectacle. It was a macabre theater of morality. Henrietta Goggins claimed a seat in the second row, her eyes glittering with anticipation. Mayor Archibald Hastings and his son Billy sat in the front pew, looking somber and deeply satisfied. Sheriff Tom Dempsey stood near the back doors, arms crossed, uncomfortable with the proceedings but unwilling to interfere with church business. At exactly 10 o'clock, Reverend Josiah Preston stepped up to the pulpit. He looked aged, his face drawn and pale, his eyes blazing with a fanatical, feverish light. "We are gathered here today," Josiah's voice boomed, rattling the stained glass windows, "to carve out a rot that has festered in the very heart of our community. A betrayal of God, of decency, and of blood." He gestured to the side door. Two church elders led Abigail into the sanctuary. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Abigail was dressed in plain, unbleached cotton, the garment of a penitent. She looked exhausted, frail, and terribly young. The slight swell of her pregnancy was unmistakable beneath the thin fabric. She kept her eyes fixed on the scuffed wooden floorboards as she was guided to a solitary wooden stool placed dead center before the altar. "Abigail Preston," Josiah said, his voice trembling with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "You stand before God and your neighbors, bearing the fruit of grievous sin. You have brought shame upon this house and this town. Today, you will name the agent of your corruption, so that he might be held to account, and you will leave this town forever." Abigail gripped the edges of the stool, her knuckles turning white. Tears spilled over her lashes, tracing clean lines down her dusty cheeks. "Name him, Abigail," an anonymous woman shouted from the back. "Tell us," echoed another. Josiah slammed his hand on the pulpit. "Silence. The sinner will speak. Abigail, who is the father of this bastard child?" In the front row, Billy Hastings casually picked a piece of lint off his wool suit, casting a mocking, confident glance at the girl. He knew she wouldn't speak. He had made sure of it, pinning her behind the harvest tents, pressing a cold blade against her ribs, and promising that if she ever breathed a word of what he took from her, he would see her father's church burned to the ground with the reverend inside. Abigail opened her mouth. Her voice was a dry, broken whisper. I cannot say." "You must," Josiah roared, stepping down from the pulpit and looming over her. "You will not protect the coward who did this. Name him." "Please, Father," Abigail sobbed, wrapping her arms around her stomach. "Let me go. Just let me go into the cold. I will leave. I won't name him." "Then you are a harlot and a liar, entirely forsaken by God," Josiah screamed, raising his hand as if to strike her. Suddenly, the heavy double doors at the back of the church burst open with an explosive crack. The wind howled into the sanctuary, bringing a swirl of snow and freezing air that extinguished half the candles in the room. The entire congregation twisted in their pews. Sheriff Dempsey's hand instinctively went to the Colt revolver at his hip. Framed in the doorway, blocking out the gray daylight, was Morgan Montgomery. He looked like a creature born of the earth and winter itself. He wore a heavy coat of wolf and bear fur, dusted thick with fresh snow. A Winchester rifle was slung casually over his broad shoulder, and a hunting knife the size of a man's forearm rested on his hip. His dark hair was wild, his beard thick, and his eyes piercing. Ice-cold blue scanned the terrified congregation before locking onto the girl weeping at the altar. Silence descended on the church. It was absolute, suffocating silence. Even Reverend Josiah froze, his hands suspended in the air. Morgan stepped inside, his heavy leather boots thudding against the floorboards. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was deafening in the quiet room. As he walked down the center aisle, the townsfolk leaned away from him, pulling their children close, terrified of the raw, masculine violence radiating from the mountain man. He didn't look at Henrietta Goggins. He didn't look at the sheriff. He walked straight past Mayor Hastings and Billy, though his eyes lingered on the younger Hastings for a fraction of a second. A look so sharp and menacing that Billy actually flinched and shrank back into his pew. Morgan stopped in front of the altar, towering over Reverend Josiah. The preacher swallowed hard, trying to muster his righteous indignation. But he was a man of words, facing a man of blood and bone. "What is the meaning of this?" Josiah demanded, his voice cracking. "This is a sacred house. You have no business here, Montgomery." Morgan ignored him. He looked down at Abigail. She stared up at him, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. She had seen the mountain man perhaps 3 times in her life. Always from a distance, always from the safety of the mercantile porch. She didn't know him. Morgan reached down and gently, with a tenderness that defied his savage appearance, placed his massive calloused hand on Abigail's trembling shoulder. He turned his head slowly, sweeping his gaze across the sea of judgmental faces, resting finally on Reverend Josiah. When Morgan spoke, his voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that rumbled through the floorboards and settled in the chest of every person in the room. "You want to know who the father is?" Morgan asked, his tone deadly calm. He pulled Abigail gently to her feet, tucking her against his side to shield her from the crowd. "That child is mine." A collective shriek erupted from the women. Henrietta Goggins fainted dead away, sliding out of the pew and onto the floor. Mayor Hastings leaped to his feet, sputtering in outrage. "Yours?" Josiah gasped, staggering backward as if physically struck. "You? An animal from the hills? You touched my daughter?" Abigail looked up at Morgan, her lips parted in bewildered protest. She opened her mouth to speak, to deny it, but Morgan's hand tightened ever so slightly on her shoulder, a silent, commanding plea. "Play along," his grip seemed to say. "Let me save you." "Mine," Morgan repeated, louder this time, his hand dropping to rest on the stock of his Winchester. The metallic click of the safety being thumbed off echoed clearly over the gasps of the crowd. "And I've come to collect my family. Any man who has a problem with that can step out into the snow with me right now." He stared directly at Billy Hastings. Billy turned pale, his eyes darting to the floor, sweat beading on his forehead despite the draft. He said nothing. Morgan wrapped his heavy fur coat around Abigail's trembling shoulders, enveloping her in the scent of pine, wood smoke, and safety. "We're leaving," he told the Reverend. "If any one of you follows us, or speaks her name again, I'll burn this whole town to the dirt." With that, the mountain man turned and walked Abigail Preston down the aisle, right through the parted sea of Bitter Creek's hypocrites, and out into the howling storm. The ride up into the Wind River Range was a brutal, freezing blur. Abigail sat atop one of Morgan's sturdy pack mules, wrapped so thickly in furs she could barely move, while the mountain man walked ahead, breaking the trail through the deepening snow. The wind howled like a wounded animal, erasing their tracks almost as soon as they were made. Bitter Creek, with all its hypocrisies and terrors, vanished beneath a blanket of white. For hours, they did not speak. The only sounds were the crunch of Morgan's boots, the rhythmic snorting of the mules, and the relentless shriek of the blizzard. Abigail's mind raced with a terrifying cocktail of relief and dread. She had been saved from the immediate wrath of her father, but she was now entirely at the mercy of a wilderness legend, a man who had just claimed to the entire world that he was the father of her unborn child. It was near nightfall when the silhouette of a cabin finally emerged from the whiteout. Built from massive, hand-hewn pine logs and tucked beneath the protective overhang of a granite cliff, it looked less like a house and more like a fortress. Morgan helped her down from the mule. His hands, though calloused and massive, were surprisingly gentle. Inside, the cabin was nothing like the savage den she had imagined. It was impeccably clean. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, and within minutes, Morgan had a roaring fire going. There were shelves lined with preserved food, neatly folded blankets, and hand-carved wooden furniture. It smelled of dried sage, cedar, and old leather. Morgan poured her a tin cup of hot chicory coffee and pushed a plate of dried venison and hardtack toward her. He sat across from her at the heavy oak table, the firelight catching the gray streaks in his beard. "Eat," he commanded quietly. Abigail took a trembling sip of the bitter coffee. She looked at him, her chest tight with unasked questions. "Why did you do it?" she finally whispered, her voice cracking. "Why did you claim this child? You don't know me. I don't know you." Morgan leaned back, pulling a small, worn leather pouch from his heavy coat. "I know more than you think, Miss Preston." He opened the pouch and tipped it over the table. A small, heavy object clattered against the wood. It rolled to a stop right in front of Abigail. It was a solid silver cufflink, engraved with an ornate, curling H. Abigail gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her blood ran cold. The memory of that horrific night, the smell of whiskey, the rough bark of the oak tree against her back, the sharp bite of the blade at her throat came rushing back with sickening clarity. "I was in town for the Autumn Harvest Festival," Morgan said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "I don't care for crowds, so I kept to the shadows near the Cooper's shed. I heard the struggle. By the time I dropped my gear and got around the building, it was done. He had a knife on you. I heard what he told you, that if you spoke, your father would burn. I knew if I killed him right then, they'd hang you as an accomplice to a savage. The Hastings boy owns that town." Tears streamed down Abigail's face. She had felt so completely alone, so entirely abandoned by God and man. To know that someone had seen, that someone knew the truth of her suffering, broke the dam inside her. She wept, burying her face in her hands. "I found that in the dirt after you both ran off," Morgan continued, gesturing to the cufflink. "I kept my ear to the ground. When I heard the rumors, heard what your father was planning to do to you today, I figured it was time to come down the mountain. They'll kill us," Abigail sobbed. "Billy Hastings won't let this go. He knows you took me. He'll realize you know." "Let them try," Morgan said, a dangerous, feral light flashing in his pale eyes. "The mountain is mine. The winter is mine. You stay here, Miss Preston. You eat, you rest, and you bring that baby into the world safe. Come the spring thaw, if you want to leave. I'll take you to the rail station in Cheyenne and give you the gold to start a new life. But until then, no one touches you." And so began their strange, isolated existence. As December bled into January, and January into a bitterly cold February, Abigail discovered the man beneath the legend. Morgan was a man of few words, but profound action. He carved a sturdy cradle from birchwood. He taught her how to bake bread using sourdough starter, how to read the tracks of snowshoe hares, and how to fire a Winchester rifle so it wouldn't bruise her shoulder. The suffocating, pious fear her father had instilled in her began to melt away, replaced by the quiet, enduring strength of the high timber. She was no longer a disgraced girl. She was a survivor. But down in the valley, Bitter Creek was brewing a toxic storm. Billy Hastings was losing his mind. The terrifying glare Morgan had given him in the church haunted his drunken sleep. He knew the mountain man hadn't claimed the girl out of lust. He suspected Morgan had been there that night. If Abigail talked to the trapper, and the trapper talked to the federal marshal in Cheyenne, Billy's empire of wealth and privilege would crumble into dust. He needed them both dead. Working on his father's wounded pride and Reverend Josiah's humiliated rage, Billy painted a picture of a kidnapped victim. "He took her by force, Sheriff," Billy spat, slamming his fist on the desk in the jailhouse. "That animal is keeping a God-fearing woman captive up there. We have a moral duty to bring her back and hang that savage from a pine tree." Sheriff Tom Dempsey was hesitant. "It's the dead of winter, Billy, and she didn't look like she was fighting him. She was terrified," Reverend Josiah interjected, his eyes wild with fanaticism. "He bewitched her. We must save my daughter's soul." With the mayor's money funding the expedition, a posse of 8 heavily armed men was formed. They waited for a break in the weather, a brief window of clear skies in late February. Led by Billy Hastings and Deputy Caleb Brooks, the men mounted their hardiest horses and began the treacherous, icy ascent toward Morgan Montgomery's claim. The morning the posse arrived, the air was unnaturally still, crisp and blindingly bright as the sun reflected off the snowdrifts. Morgan had known they were coming since dawn. The jays had gone quiet, and his mules had been restless. smelling the sweat of strange horses miles down the trail. "Stay inside," Morgan told Abigail, racking the lever of his Winchester. "Keep the door barred. Do not come out unless I call for you." Abigail, now heavy with child, placed a hand on his arm. She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and clear. "Be careful, Morgan." He nodded once, a brief, silent promise, and stepped out into the freezing air, closing the heavy oak door behind him. He positioned himself on the high ridge, overlooking the only trail leading to his cabin. 10 minutes later, the posse breached the tree line. The horses were lathered and exhausted, their breath pluming in the cold air. Billy Hastings rode near the front, flanked by Deputy Brooks and half a dozen hired guns from O'Malley's saloon. "That's far enough." Morgan's voice boomed down the canyon, echoing off the granite walls like thunder. The riders pulled up, their horses skittish. They looked up to see the mountain man standing tall against the skyline, his rifle resting casually over his forearm, aiming down at them. "Montgomery!" Billy shouted, his voice betraying a tremor of fear he tried to mask with arrogance. "We're here under the authority of the mayor of Bitter Creek. Bring the girl out. You're under arrest for kidnapping." "She's not a captive, Hastings," Morgan called back, his tone dangerously even. "And you have no authority past the tree line. Turn around." "Don't listen to him," Billy yelled to the posse, drawing his silver-plated revolver. "He's a madman. Take him down." The hired guns hesitated. Facing a cornered mountain man on his own territory was a fool's errand. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door of the cabin creaked open. Morgan whipped his head around. "Abigail, no!" But Abigail stepped out onto the porch. She didn't look like the frail, weeping girl from the church. She wore one of Morgan's heavy wool coats, her golden hair braided back from her face, her jaw set in stone. In her hands, she held Morgan's spare rifle, the barrel pointed squarely at the posse. "I am not a captive," Abigail's voice rang out, clear and piercing in the cold air. "I am here by choice." The posse murmured in confusion. Deputy Brooks held up a hand, signaling the men to lower their weapons. "Miss Preston? Your father sent us to bring you home." "I have no father," Abigail replied coldly. "Not a man who would throw me to the wolves to save his own pride. And the only wolf here is the man riding next to you, Deputy." She pointed a gloved finger directly at Billy Hastings. Billy's face drained of color. She's got cabin fever. He's corrupted her mind. Shoot him!" Silence. Deputy Brooks barked, looking between Billy and Abigail. "What are you saying, Miss Preston?" "I am saying that Morgan Montgomery is an honorable man who saved my life," Abigail declared, stepping off the porch and walking slowly toward the edge of the ridge, standing shoulder to shoulder with Morgan. "The child I carry belongs to William Hastings." A shocked gasp rippled through the posse. "Liar!" Billy screamed, his horse dancing nervously. "She's a lying whore." Abigail reached into her pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch. She threw it with all her might. It landed in the snow a few feet from Deputy Brooks's horse. "Open it, Caleb," Abigail commanded. The deputy dismounted cautiously, keeping his eyes on Morgan, and scooped up the pouch. He opened the drawstrings and tipped the silver cufflink into his palm. He stared at the engraved H. Every man in Bitter Creek knew those custom cufflinks. Billy had bragged about importing them from Chicago. Brooks looked up, his expression hardening as he turned to Billy. "You reported these stolen the day after the Harvest Festival, Billy." "They were," Billy stammered, sweat freezing on his brow. "He must have stolen them. He planted it." "He dropped it in the dirt behind the cooper's shed," Abigail said, her voice trembling now, but with righteous fury, not fear. "When he held a skinning knife to my throat and told me if I ever told a soul, he would burn my father's church down with him inside it." The men from Bitter Creek stared at Billy in absolute disgust. The golden boy of their town was suddenly revealed as a monster. Realizing he was trapped, panic overtook Billy. With a wild animalistic cry, he raised his silver revolver and aimed it directly at Abigail's chest. "I'll kill you." He never got to pull the trigger. The crack of Morgan's Winchester was deafening. He didn't shoot to kill. He shot for justice. The heavy, .44 caliber bullet shattered Billy's right shoulder. The revolver flew from his hand into the snowbed, and Billy tumbled from his saddle, screaming in agony as he hit the icy ground. Silence descended on the ridge, broken only by Billy's pathetic whimpering. Morgan stood like a statue, the barrel of his rifle smoking. Deputy Brooks looked at the bleeding man on the ground, then up at Morgan and Abigail. He tipped his hat respectfully. "Mr. Montgomery, Miss Preston, I apologize for the intrusion." Brooks turned to the hired guns. "Tie him to his horse. We're taking Mr. Hastings back to town to face a judge." As the posse dragged the sobbing, bleeding Billy Hastings down the mountain, Abigail let out a long, shuddering breath. The rifle slipped from her hands into the snow. Morgan was beside her in an instant, wrapping his massive arms around her, pulling her against his chest. For the first time, she buried her face in his coat and cried tears of absolute relief. The storm was over. Spring brought justice to Bitter Creek. Billy Hastings traded his tailored suits for a territorial prison cell. Abigail never returned to her father's suffocating church. Instead, she chose the high timber. When her son was born, Morgan held the boy not as a savior, but as a father. They built a quiet life above the judgment of men, rooted in the wild, enduring truth of the mountains.